Hello, I'm Pedro Reina Perez. Thank you for being here. I'm most grateful. I was originally scheduled to be here in June, but death in the family prevented me from being here. So I'm happy to be competing with the Fiestas Patronales, and I most certainly appreciate your attendance today. I'm a historian and I'm a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and I'm currently working on a project, on a public humanities project about the Insular Cases. And that's how this short lecture came about, because in the current state of affairs here in the United States, do believe that it is time to denounce the Insular Cases as what they are, a legal doctrine based on racism that basically subjects Puerto Ricans in the island to conditions that are clearly unjustifiable and intolerable. So I entitled this, How Does the Insular Cases Prolong Colonialism in Puerto Rico? Just to give you a short introduction, this is a graphic from The Economist in 2013. You can basically tell that Puerto Rico is a sinkhole in the middle of the Caribbean, and they compared Puerto Rico to Greece, who at the time was undergoing a tremendous financial crisis. There was an article in El Nuevo Día, Puerto Rico's leading newspaper, yesterday, written by Eduardo Batia, claiming that Puerto Rico could learn from what Greece went through, because, Greece is finally coming out of the other side of the tunnel. He did mention that Greece is a sovereign country and it benefited from being a member of the European Union, while Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory of the United States, whatever that means, and that makes it game for whatever the US Congress decides. So, as you all know, Puerto Rico has been undergoing a deep financial crisis. I say hello because the lady is just walking and went to high school with me. So I'm kind of surprised. ¿Qué tal? So, okay, Carmen, you just missed that one. So essentially, Puerto Rico has been undergoing an unprecedented fiscal crisis. Just to give you some context, and we've been undergoing an 18-year economic depression, which is something that it's rarely mentioned in the press. Puerto Rico's economy has been tanked since 2006, and that conditions what happens in the island. And it has also been undergoing a political crisis. I mentioned here the People versus Sanchez Valle, which is a landmark case that was decided based on the Insular Cases. And, of course, a humanitarian crisis brought about not only by the government's bankruptcy, but by natural disasters, the pandemic, and that in turn has produced a giant exodus that has basically emptied Puerto Rico, basically.
What was the Sanchez Valle decision?
I will get to it in a slide in a second, but basically it stripped Puerto Rico of the notion that the Estado Libre Asociado was un pacto bilateral between the United States and Puerto Rico. And its wording is very important because, it basically strips all the legitimacy that Puerto Rico had before, basically laid bare the trappings of colonialism in the island. Financial crisis is easily explained. Puerto Rico borrowed more than it could pay. And it incurred, debt with its retirement, public employee retirement fund. And on top of that, Puerto Rico does not, even though Puerto Ricans pay payroll taxes, as everyone here in the States, we do not get Social Security and Medicare in the same amount as we would if we lived stateside. So essentially, the U.S. Congress discriminates against Puerto Rico, and due to the fact that we supposedly don't pay income taxes. I say supposedly because we do pay taxes. We pay taxes to the shipping companies that force upon us the cabotage laws that do not allow us to, bring goods from the United States in ships other than those owned, built, and manned by U.S. companies. So we pay a 25% tax to shipping companies instead of the federal government. But of course, they still say we don't pay taxes, so we're not entitled to these benefits. On top of everything, Promesa, and I will put Promesa in context in a minute, basically put Puerto Rico under the power of a tremendously powerful fiscal management board, whose members are appointed by Congress and enjoy full immunity. So there's no way you can question their decisions. They basically took over the government's finances. So the Puerto Rican crisis has been explained strictly on economic foundations, but it's much more than that. It's not just the fact that the government went bankrupt. It's also that structural conditions basically make Puerto Rico a subject of many irrational or perhaps too rational decisions by the U.S. in terms of its relationship with us. I like to show this drawing, this cartoon. There's a wonderful story. The Spanish-American War was told through cartoons. There's a book called La Guerra del 98 en Caricaturas, which shows you how the U.S. newspapers and Spanish newspapers approach the subject. And this is a very typical caricature. You have Uncle Sam and you have the lady in distress. She has something in her waist that says Cuba. And of course, the man dressed in black, the old man, is Spain. It was evident that at the time of the Spanish-American War and the years preceding it, the United States was actively looking for a military solution to a growing desire to use its navy to project its power beyond the east and west coast. And the Caribbean was looked at as an ideal place to establish some refueling stations. Cuba did not fit that profile because it was too close to Florida. However, Puerto Rico was much more to the east, and as a result, much more coveted and more practical in terms of military purposes. Here's another caricatura from a newspaper. This one says, holding his end up, and you have Uncle Sam dressed as if he were a circus artist, but you can tell that there are 5 black subjects portrayed as infants, half naked. And if you look closely, they're holding flags that say Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, ladrones. I don't know what the one in the middle says. But essentially, it tells you a lot about how the United States envisioned the Caribbean and the newly acquired territories after the war, which was basically the Philippines and Guam. So this new relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States brought about new questions. Okay, now that we remember that the United States is coming, or supposedly coming, from an anti-imperialist tradition, but now it has fully embarked into an imperialist project that it wants to, keep undercover. To this day, there's a wonderful book called How to Hide an Empire. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you read it. The United States has actively denied the fact that it has an empire, that it has territories that it are subjected to its plenary powers. So one of the first questions that had to be answered was, now that we own these islands, are these people citizens? If this is our land, what are the political privileges of people there? In a very succinct question, the question was, does the Constitution follow the flag? Because it would follow, using logic, that now that we have new territories, there would, be, one would expect that political rights based on the Constitution would be valid there. But the case in 1901 was brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, and the cases that follow, not just that one, Downs versus Bidwell is the name, but the ones that followed basically gave birth to what is called the Insular Cases doctrine. So the answer by the U.S. Supreme Court was no, the Constitution does not follow the flag. These are newly acquired territories, but it's peoples that come from a completely different tradition from ours. They are people of color, they are alien, they are not entitled to the full benefits of the U.S. Constitution. It's really interesting. If you want to delve more into this topic, I suggest you look up in YouTube a one-day conference that took place in 2014 in Harvard Law School called Reconsidering the Insular Cases. It was a full day of panels and a plenary session, and the Harvard Law School felt obliged to hold this full day activity because it was in Harvard's legal journals that the rationale for what would be the insular cases was developed. So legal scholars at the school had already entertained the question because it was evident that the United States at some point was going to invade or invade, yes, there's no other way to put it. And some of these questions needed legal reasoning. So it was very clear that Spanish subjects, as Puerto Ricans were looked upon as Spanish subjects, they came from a monarchic or monarchical tradition. They were Catholic, and they were of mixed race. Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, are evolved from the slave plantation because Spain essentially turned its colonies into factories for the production of sugar and other goods. So those 3 or 4 things were thought of as negatives, as something that was contrary to Anglo-Saxon traditions, common law, etc. So essentially the Supreme Court, in the use of many, many wonderful and tragic phrases, thought of Puerto Rico as foreign in a domestic sense. Foreign because it is ours, we own it, but it doesn't belong to the United States. That's another wonderful phrase. Puerto Rico belongs to, but is not a part of the United States. If you look at the U.S. Constitution under Article 4, it talks about property. And that, in that section of the Constitution, is where the cases are grounded. This is our property, and we get to decide what we do there. I include this quote, this meant that the inhabitants of unincorporated territories, it made a distinction between incorporated and unincorporated. The unincorporated territories was that category where you would include territories or properties that were part of that belonged to the United States, but there were no plans for total inclusion or admission into the Union. That needs to be compared to incorporated territories, such as Oklahoma at the time, which was basically being prepared for full admission into the Union. But you needed a category for, that animated suspension in which you would put people in territories that were going nowhere. And that's how the unincorporated territory definition came about. This meant that the inhabitants of unincorporated territories, even if they are U.S. citizens, may lack constitutional rights because they were not part of the United States. Essentially, the justification for the insular cases was racism, plain and simple. The insular cases was just a foundation for colonialism displayed, Puerto Rico just turned 125 years under the U.S. flag this past July, and essentially the plan has always been exploitation, the extraction of wealth and resources in exchange for very little. However, I should also mention that these cases are still being used today, and I will give one example in a minute, but the reasoning of the insular cases has not changed one bit. Whenever the U.S. Supreme Court faces an opportunity to review the cases, they basically invoke the basic tenet of the cases, which is that the Congress holds unilateral power over Puerto Rico. That's the court's way of saying, I'm kicking the can, I'm not doing anything. Let the Congress decide what to do with Puerto Rico. Essentially, that is what the insular cases doctrine means, coming from the Supreme Court. I meant to say before that aside from Congress being named as the source of authority for all matters concerning Puerto Rico, it's a discrimination based on geography. Essentially, the minute you moved, Puerto Ricans became citizens in 1917. I will mention that in a minute. While you live in Puerto Rico, you're deprived. You don't pay income tax, but you're deprived of a congressional delegation and the right to vote for your president. However, if you hop on a plane and come to Massachusetts, the minute you land, you are fully vested and are able to exercise that right. This is interesting because I'm sure you've seen headlines in the paper in which people, very wealthy people, have been attracted to Puerto Rico through law, what was previously Laws 20 and 22, now it's Law 60, which basically says that if you move to Puerto Rico and you live there more than 186 days and you bring an X amount of money and you open a business, you get taxed at 4%. 4%? I'm a university professor. I'm taxed at like 33. I pay 11.5 sales tax. So between one thing and the other, I pay 50% of my income in taxes. Yet, if I were to, if someone is to move to the island and meet these conditions, you get a fixed rate of 4%. So that's why you are hearing more and more, resentment towards people who come to the island to enjoy these benefits in the face of people undergoing a lot of hardship because the government is basically not functioning well. So Down versus Bidwell, again, the first case is a landmark case because it actually referred to the people there as savage tribes, and considered the fact that the administration of alien races may be impossible. So when you consider the current political climate here, in which division and mistrust is ever present, one wonders, this was 100 and something years ago, and now we're in the 21st century, and we're facing, tremendously complex questions. The Harvard Law Review in 2018 did a special number of the review, basically considering what role the courts may take to address the inequalities brought about by the insular cases. And Puerto Rico's very own Juan Torruella, who passed away a few years ago and was the only Puerto Rican appellate judge at the time, was a very savvy legal scholar who was always writing on these matters and always trying to kick the can in the direction of the Supreme Court. Whenever he got a chance to decide a case that would put the questions straight on their face, he would go for it. But he was very, very adamant to support that the courts be the ones deciding or taking a more activist role in deciding matters related to the insular cases. That is why he wrote this article, Why Puerto Rico Does Not Need Further Experimentation with Its Future, a reply to the notion of territorial federalism. In essence, territorial federalism was an idea, I guess, to have the courts address the inequalities of the relationship, given the fact that the Congress can't decide anything at this point. And Torroya was very forceful in his opinion that enough, this needs to be addressed by the executive and the legislative and not be left to the courts. He argued that Puerto Rico had undergone 4 experiments, and he was saying, no more experiments, please. We've undergone too many of them. Number 1 was the Foraker Act, which basically brought us from military rule from 1898 to 1900, and basically gave Puerto Rico the general shape of civil government. The second was the John Shafroth Act of 1917, which granted Puerto Ricans full citizenship, not full citizenship. And this was, during the First World War, when the United States was afraid that Germany may invade some of its possessions in the Caribbean. So that's why the United States bought the U.S. Virgin Islands from Denmark at the same time that it legislated to grant Puerto Rican citizenship. The third one was Public Law 600, and I will speak about it in a bit, which gave us ELA, or Estado Libre Asociado, which essentially, after the Second World War, created this fantasy that Puerto Rico had achieved a level of autonomy and that it no longer required supervision. So the United States went before the United Nations and said, hey, take Puerto Rico out of the list of colonies from which, all powers need to report on. Puerto Rico is no longer a colony. It has achieved a level of self-government. And the United States did go ahead and remove Puerto Rico from there. But all of this came crashing through in 2016 when the U.S. Supreme Court, again, created Promesa, number 1, which basically stripped the notion that the Puerto Rican government was somewhat sovereign. It essentially said, power of the purse is removed from you by an act of Congress and given to this fiscal management board. And that, of course, was debated given the fact that Puerto Rico did not become indebted on its own. In the process of becoming indebted, many Wall Street firms became absurdly rich. Many of the bond sales that took place over the years took place with, the blessing of the federal authorities. But when it came the time to, take responsibility for those actions, the U.S. government at the time said, so sorry, the full burden is placed on you. We're not going to do anything. There were, suggestions that the federal treasury issue some sort of bond to, assume part of the debt or the totality of the debt, place it, in this special financial instrument. But those conversations ended really quick. They'll pay for it. And here we are. I jumped the first 2 experiments and went to the third because in 1952, Luis Muñoz Marin was elected governor in 1948, but he was governor at the time, and you can see the cover of Time magazine in which Puerto Rico is portrayed as, a democracy, an experiment in democracy in Latin America, because it was allowed to write a constitution. That constitution had all the appearances of a sovereign constitution. It was voted by the people, but the fine print said that the U.S. Congress retained power throughout. So it was just a symbolic exercise. I would argue that it worked for a while because there was a general agreement after the war and the Great Depression that something needed to be done. So people decided to partake in this fantasy willingly. It lasted for a while. Eventually, it showed its limitations and things changed. But the United Nations, as I mentioned before, gave its blessing to this removal of Puerto Rico from the list of colonies. So some of the contradictions in this law was that in its first line it said, "This is in the nature of a compact." You cannot enter into a compact, proclaiming that it's in the spirit of. You either enter into a contract or you don't. If you enter into a contract, you need to be, of age, which basically means fully responsible for your actions. So as a result, "this is in the spirit of a compact" has become a really troublesome phrase, because the courts have reflected and decided cases through over a century trying to figure out what that means. But again, ambiguity was part of the formula from the beginning. But essentially, some people said what Puerto Rico got was the right to manage their own budget. Forget the Constitution. They have the right to put together a budget and to administer it. And that indeed moved Puerto Rico from an agrarian to an industrial economy. But eventually, it showed its limitations. Fast forward the movie, and this phrase here, unión permanente in Spanish, permanent union, was another wonderful phrase that, condensed aspirations, because the Partido Popular Democrático always proclaimed that el Estado Libre Asociado was the permanent union, whatever that means, because it has no, permanent union is not a legal phrase, considering that the first thing was, agreed to in the nature of a compact. So permanent is a slippery word here. So opponents of Estado Libre Asociado always said there's no such thing as unión permanente, because you did not enter into a compact between equals. This was a rather asymmetrical agreement. So if there is a permanent union or not, how so? In 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court considered two cases, Puerto Rico versus Sanchez Valle and Puerto Rico versus Franklin California Tax-Free Trust. I'm not going to refer much to the second, but the first one was really important because it is what I call a law and order type of case in which someone was being charged in the state government for something that they had already been charged in the federal government. So that's, as you know, if you watch Law and Order, it's called double jeopardy. You don't get to charge someone twice for the same count. But in this case, Puerto Rico, up until 2016, had been working, just as if it were a state. The idea of double sovereignty, the sovereignty of the state. Remember that when the 13 colonies became independent, for a minute they were sovereign, and then they entered into a federation of states. So legally speaking, or philosophically speaking, they enjoyed sovereignty for a minute before they enter into a compact with the other colonies. So that is the fountain, la fuente del derecho, where some of, the federal government and its authority comes from. But in this case, as I explained here, Puerto Rico is defending its position as a self-governing entity to prosecute two individuals for gun crimes who were previously convicted in federal court of the same incidents. This would typically be a case of double jeopardy. The Supreme Court has ruled that the ban does not apply if the same crime is punished in the courts of separate sovereign entities. Up until that day, everything was working fine, except that when the justices decided to take a closer look, they went looking for that 1 minute of sovereignty, and they concluded that it never existed because Puerto Rico was ceded by Spain to the United States through the Treaty of Paris. And in it, Puerto Rico was never for a second independent or sovereign. It was basically transferred to the United States. Puerto Ricans were not even given the chance to stay Spanish subjects. It was only extended, that privilege was only extended to peninsulares, those who came from Spain and lived in the island. If you were an islander, you were not given a chance to retain your Spanish citizenship. So essentially, from 1898 to 1917, Puerto Ricans were citizens of the universe, I guess. They were U.S. nationals, to use a contemporary term. They had no citizenship. So in the opinion written by Justice Kagan for the majority, she concluded, as I just said, that there was no basis to consider that the Puerto Rican government could exercise any measure of sovereignty that would allow it to undertake this case. So essentially, from that day on, the double jeopardy clause applies to Puerto Rico, and if you're prosecuted in the federal government, you cannot be prosecuted in the state courts, because as a result, Puerto Rico enjoys no sovereignty. So I choose this image because it sort of conveys the idea that Puerto Rico is like in suspended animation. Of course, suspended animation, and then Maria, Irma, earthquakes, COVID, crypto millionaires, and fill in the blank has happened. When I, and I have to say that I'm very privileged to come and go. But whatever you hear about what's going on in Puerto Rico, it's true. People are undergoing a lot of hardship. Finding a doctor, an appointment, treatment has become tremendously difficult. Hospitals are in dire straits today. Hospitals are closing delivery rooms for babies. There are, not that many births in the island, so for some hospitals, it is not practical to have services, and it's very complicated. But it's whatever you hear, it's not exaggerated. It's hard. That's a show of Maria. September is coming around, and it's going to be the 6th anniversary of the hurricane. We were talking about the university. Not one building in my university has been repaired after Maria. Not one. And the reasons are many, but one of them is that FEMA has made life miserable for the government to get access to the money to rebuild. So the university, the public university that I teach at, University of Puerto Rico, used to have 4 student residences. Right now, almost all of them are closed because they are so badly in need of repair. So you can walk through the island and still see the scars from the natural disasters. This was something that doesn't need much explanation, and Maria and what happened after that set in motion a number of processes that have incentivized that the young leave the island looking for better opportunities here, and as a result you have what the late economist Elias Gutierrez used to call Puerto Rico is becoming a ghetto of children and the elderly. Because if you fly to Puerto Rico and you fly from Logan, just count how many wheelchairs there are, and you can see that coming or going, you can get 15 or 20 wheelchairs for people coming and going from Puerto Rico, and this is something that requires a lot of attention. The question of uncertainty hovers over everything because, what are we to do? As you know, Puerto Ricans are divided between favoring statehood, full inclusion into the Union, or autonomy or independence. But at this point, given the political climate here, if you watch the news closely, you will get no consolation from listening to Ron DeSantis say that he's going to pardon Trump and prosecute every single prosecutor who's ever charged Trump. So if that were to happen, I don't know, where Puerto Rico is going to be in that order of business, but it's not of comfort. I can tell you. So most people tell me, what can we do? And I can only think of one thing. In times of Black Lives Matter and so many social episodes of the promotion of social justice here, that one can only denounce the fact that today you have a U.S. Supreme Court that looks upon Puerto Rico and says it's okay to discriminate at you because you are simply inferior based on your race, and wait for the U.S. Congress to do something about it. You know, it's not tolerable, it's not justifiable, and it requires that we come together and basically call it what it is. It's, you know, flagrant racism in the 21st century. I leave you with this other wonderful cartoon from The Economist, you know. I'm not entirely in agreement with it, you know, letting Puerto Rico dig itself deeper into a hole while the others watch. There's responsibility to be shared, but certainly it is something that cannot be ignored. So that's the end of my presentation. Perhaps you have questions or comments. Adelante.
Gracias. Thank you so much for your presentation, number one. My question is, and can you repeat it on your own microphone? Oh, okay. All right.
Testing.
My question is, the economic debacle of Puerto Rico. I think it started a little bit earlier, in 2000, as a result of the governorship of the 1990s, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
It was Pedro Rosselló who took out all those loans in the form of bonds.
Agreed.
And to this day, we don't know who signed those contracts with those bond companies or those banks that said, okay, for every 25 cents they're going to lend Puerto Rico, we have to pay back 75 cents. And that's how we get into the billions of dollars in debt. And then successive governors just kept, as you were saying, kicking the can down the whatever it is, the street. And when you say denounce, I understand what denounce means, but what does it mean in terms of action is my question to you.
Well, there's not a single answer to that. I think that we need to speak up about this. We need to name it for what it is, and we need to address it at different levels. We need to address it at the local government. In places like Holyoke, folks here get to exercise, you know, political power, however discreetly. You have a say, you have representatives, you have congressmen and congresswomen that go to Congress and represent your interests. We need to raise our voices and make people aware that what happens in Puerto Rico, like I said, is intolerable in terms of the exploitation of resources, in terms of the poverty that people are being subjected to. I am in full agreement with what you said, and for expediency, I did not go into it, but the 1990s were not only terrible for how many, you know, debt the government incurred, but also because the government promoted the elimination of Section 936, which, you know, you can look at Puerto Rico's economic history throughout the 20th century, and at every turn, it was designed to benefit U.S. companies. Come the 1950s, a balance was achieved in terms of, you know, employment and benefits for the people, not just exploitation like in sugarcane. But you had a legal framework that incentivized companies to do business in Puerto Rico. And in 1996, the U.S. Congress decided to eliminate Section 936 of the IRS Code, which was at the time the main support for economic activity in the island, and provided no replacement. So you can trace, for 10 years, from 1996 to 2006, that was the grandfather period, the sunset clause for the law, 10 years. 1996, Puerto Rico had a lot of pharmaceuticals that were capital intensive but provided money for the economy. Come 2006, many had left because there were no incentives, and neither the Puerto Rican government nor the Congress had put something in its place. So to this day, that basic idea about how are we going to create economic activity in the island is begs to be answered. Yes, we have tourism. Yes, we have retail. Yes, we have the service economy, but that's not enough to support us. We're still struggling, and we shall remain, we shall continue to struggle until someone comes to its senses. So in a way, my call for denunciation is not just to, denounce the racism. It's also to address the fact that Congress needs to take action to allow Puerto Rico to come out of the hole. At the same time that I'm saying that a lot of people leave, I have a lot of students at the university who refuse to leave. On the contrary, or students that have left that are coming back. And I'm saying, yeah, I've been trained here in the United States, but I want to go back. It's quite a courageous act, I have to say, because when you have a certain age, your age sort of colors how you look at things, and the older you are, perhaps the more pessimistic. But I have to say there are people there, striving to make the island better in the face of tremendous adversity. Yes.
Great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can you speak a little bit to the mindset of the Puerto Rican? Not to kind of use this a little bit as kind of forming my question, but I was eavesdropping on the conversation earlier, and I think it was you that were talking about something that I kind of see in terms of the apathy that the Puerto Rican mindset is. Very simple, very practical. There's a festival outside, packed. We're having a discussion, learning about these things, not packed. And so, in my experience, and just to kind of give you some context, mami es de Junco, papi es de Gurabo, right? But I was born and raised here. Spent some time con mi abuela en Puerto Rico, en Las Piñas, right? Un sitio en la parcela de Puerto Rico, en Junco, right? First grade, second grade. But primarily born in Hartford, got educated here, and just recently, the last 10, 15 years, really been attuned to what's happening for whatever reason. I'm in my 50s, right? But my experience with the Puerto Rican mindset has always been, déjalo así, está bien. So that apathy is there for me. So can you speak to that about the practicality of denouncing some of this stuff?
Perhaps because I live in a liberal bubble, because and not a bubble, because the people I spend my days with are really grounded and are not separated from what happens in the street. I think people are tired, but not apathetic to what's going on. We have scandal fatigue, as many do, because when you look at the media, it's one bad news after the other. But I think those who are beyond themselves with the situation have already left. They've gone on to Texas or Florida or Georgia. The young people I work with and their relatives are less scared to denounce what's going on. And in a way, a friend of mine said this, also in her 50s. She said, when I was growing up, they used to tell me that if independence were to come, schools would close, people would leave, the economy would tank. It's already happened. So bring independence, what the hell, You used to freak me out with this, and everything's happened. So I, just like it happened in 2019 when we ousted the governor, I think there's a sentiment there that it's growing and a resentment towards a government that facilitates people coming and, being empowered over people that have been there for a long time. So I would not say that people are déjalo así. I think the older you are, perhaps the more conservative in that you don't want to see things happening or break, stuff. But the younger generation, I think, are much more committed to finding answers. One example, growing up in the 80s, if you favored agriculture, if you defended growing piñas, if that's what your grandmother was growing juncos, or just the name of the barrio, pero, you're an independentista, you're so idealistic, my God, tierra. Today, agriculture is not registering as a significant number in terms of gross domestic product, but people are going back to the land to cultivate and to grow stuff for themselves and for others. That's a major change. I had a student, graduate student, who I teach at a master's program in cultural agency and administration, and she created a platform called Produce. She was into marketing, and she had friends who were growing stuff, and she wanted to connect customers to agricultores. And that platform has taken off. They have a great business model by which you order from them and they deliver to your door. They want to compete with supermarkets. It's a rather idealistic thing, but Puerto Rico Produce, when I read the project and realized that people were more concerned about where their food is coming from, something that you can understand here because it's a closer relationship to the growers here and what you eat. But I realized that there was, el germen, the seed for some sort of sovereignty through food. Perhaps, again, I'm reading too much into it, but it's a growing business. It's not losing money. And I hear all the time about people who are trying to reclaim land to grow stuff. Of course, they face a lot of hurdles. I've done a seminar. I do a seminar every year with Harvard students that come to Puerto Rico, and we just learned that speculation is the biggest enemy for agriculture, because land that is good for agriculture is being bought by people who want to build whatever, not use it for agriculture. So there's this situation in which you need to protect certain parts of the island for agriculture, but the owners of those lands are under tremendous economic pressure to sell. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it's much more gray than total cynicism or total idealism. Yo creo que people are trying to come up with solutions. And the other thing is people are trying to act locally. And locally, I mean by municipality, by barrio, trying to come together, especially after the hurricanes. The hurricanes taught us a really, really powerful lesson. Before Maria, you would always, sit down and say, la defensa civil va a venir, or la Guardia Nacional va a venir, or la madre de quien sea va a venir. In Maria, no, people realize no one's coming for us. I mean, stop waiting for someone. Either you undertake what needs to be done today, or no one's going to save you. So that also breaks, in my opinion, a really long stereotype of sitting on your hands and waiting for someone to come and do things. That the results of that will probably be beyond my lifetime, but I think it's there.
Okay. Dado el hecho de que aunque Puerto Rico tenga su propia constitución, al final del día Estados Unidos tiene los poderes plenos, ¿puede ser Puerto Rico llamado un país?
Sí, por supuesto, because to me Puerto Rico is a nation that doesn't enjoy sovereignty. As a cultural nation, todavía estamos hablando español 125 años más tarde. Nos empujaron el inglés por 50 años. And that's just one example. I know, yo sé que hay gente que no le gusta que le digan a Puerto Rico un país, sobre todo porque entienden que los aleja de la idea de que somos parte de Estados Unidos, pero en este momento sí en Puerto Rico hay anexionistas, pero son los más que se van. O sea, la demografía dice que los que favorecen la estadidad, lo puedes ver, por ejemplo, los números de la participación en las primarias del año 2016. Se esperaban 800,000 votantes en la primaria del PNP y llegaron 400,000, la mitad. Hoy día el PNP no puede ir a una elección si no le echa maíz a la gente, y ya tenemos al gobernador diciendo que va a hacer otro plebiscito el año que viene. Porque si no se le quedan los votantes en la casa. Es lo mismo que hacen aquí, que se hacía, ¿no? To mobilize voters, you need to have, proposition, whatever. I mean, it needs to be like really passionate to mobilize people. Lo mismo allí. La gente, yo me río, porque en realidad se hace evidente los trucos que tienen que hacer los partidos políticos hoy. O sea, no hay un solo partido político en Puerto Rico ahora mismo que inspire un mal pensamiento. O sea, la gente, ahí sí, when you come to political parties, people are pissed. Ahí sí que la gente los queremos matar a todos. Pero eso no es diferente acá tampoco, ¿verdad? O a otras partes del mundo donde el gobierno está tan desacreditado, donde los partidos están tan desacreditados. Carmen, micrófono. We're broadcasting. Well, actually, we're recording.
Well, you're talking about political parties and, from the diaspora. I observed the last elections, Victoria Ciudadana, and I don't know, it seemed to me that it was about the closest thing to a reasonable, grounded party. What is your take on that?
I think bipartisanship, el bipartidismo, has been terrible because it's lost any legitimacy. And there have been minority parties before, pero Victoria Ciudadana tried to put together a group of young people who offered an alternative. I voted for them, and I should also say that Puerto Ricans it has been ages since we last voted for someone. We love to go vote against someone. It's always a defensive vote, not a deliberate vote. And in this case, it was deliberate, but it was a way to, make sure people paid attention that people wanted change. I think they did really well. I think they could have done better had the PNP not changed the electoral law to allow itself to win. And I'm talking about la alcaldía de San Juan y algunas carreras para senadoras, sobre todo la de Eva Prados, which went into a recount. But as we all know, el Partido Nuevo Progresista y el Partido Popular Democrático have worked in tandem to ensure that partisan politics is their private property. The Partido Independentista also partakes in that guiso because they concluded we are going to be the only three parties in the baile. The other ones you're going to make it really hard for them to come in. So right now, Victoria Ciudadana and El PIP have tried to challenge the electoral law to see if they can get Juan Dalmau from El PIP y Manuel Natal from Victoria Ciudadana to do a joint ticket. That's illegal. You can't do it. They already challenged that in court. They failed. The system is going to be resistant to anything that breaks that privilege. They could still do it, but they would need to agree unofficially not to challenge each other for the position. Say, El PIP appoints Juan Dalmau its candidate and Victoria Ciudadana doesn't file a candidate for gobernador. And the same for alcaldía. I'm pretty sure if they were to do some version of this, they're going to become the recipients of many people's encojonamiento, for a lack of a better word. So they could probably show, really, really good results, because right now, the candidates that have been announced by El PNP and El PPD would require us to go and drink cases of beer and cry over the fiestas patronales, because it's just pathetic. So we'll see. There's a lot of discontent, and it will show, I think, somehow. Because on top of that, the PNP is probably heading into a primary between the governor and the resident commissioner. No one's looking forward to that. And on the other hand, you have El Partido Popular veering to the right and trying to capture evangelicals such as Proyecto Dignidad, which is a really minority party that has one representative and one senator, and their policies are so anti-woman, anti-everything that, one is like scared. Nothing different from what Republicans are doing here, in my opinion. But to see it in the island, it's like really shocking to see these people trying to gain political ground.
Pedro, can I follow up?
Yeah.
I want to follow up what el compañero said earlier, that out there in la fiesta patronale, and there's a thunderstorm, it's packed. Why do you think Puerto Ricans here in la diaspora are not as engaged here as they are in Puerto Rico?
Well, there could be many explanations for why we're here on a Friday night while they're there. I wouldn't, and of course I defer to you, this is just your community. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, people here are connected to culture and to identity much more than people in Puerto Rico. That's one impression I have. I don't blame, these are really trying times in which there's a lot of chatter, a lot of noise. And I know that we're still suffering from many things. I for example, in Puerto Rico, I like to say the pandemic is not over. The obvious part of the pandemic is over. But the aftermath, the emotional well-being of people, the anxiety, I witness it every day. It's just that we have entered to a different phase. But aside from us being exhausted and not wanting to overcommit ourselves, doesn't mean that we are not paying attention. I think, for example, you will hear about El Nuevo Día doing something called Junte Boricua. If you paid attention, the U.S. government has partnered with the Puerto Rico's leading newspaper to hold this big gathering of Boricuas next summer. It's called Junte Boricua, and they just devoted 4 days of articles for Massachusetts. And what they're trying to do is have Boricuas come to the island en masse from May through August of next year, for it to be, they did the research and concluded the Puerto Ricans like to go, during their vacation at some point to the island. So they basically want to harness that energy to produce economic activity in Puerto Rico. So they're doing like 3 levels of activities in big venues, small venues, mid-sized venues. I've spoken to a number of people who have spoken to the guys from Junte Boricua and Nuevo Día, and they resent that they think that Puerto Ricans from the island are telling you guys in Holyoke, come help us. And some people in Philadelphia, a friend of mine said, what do you mean? You only think of us when you need help? How about the other way around? What can you do to help us? Let's make it a two-way street, not just this, come to our rescue. Of course, solidarity after the hurricanes was tremendous, and it made a difference in many regards. But now, I think we need to do a lot of groundwork and try to connect the same, energy that bring people to the fiestas patronales. We were joking before, we didn't know which patron saint they were celebrating because most of them were evangelicals, which technically means you cannot have a patron saint, which is fantastic to explain the contradictions of being Puerto Rican. You can be evangelical and still take part in a fiesta patronal because there's no contradiction. It's fantastic. But I think it begs for political imagination and creativity to try to harness that energy. I am still amazed that every time I come to Holyoke, I can tell I'm in Puerto Rican territory because I don't need to speak to anyone. Just the aesthetic, the flags and everything tell me. I always like to point to the fact that when Puerto Ricans refer to a relative that lives in the United States, even if that person has lived for decades, they would say, I don't have una prima americana. You say, yo tengo una prima que vive. You make that distinction. The origin of your identity is there. It just happens to be that you were born in Hartford and are living in Holyoke. That is something that can be remedied at any minute. Just hop on a plane and go back. You'll be welcomed because it's like a temporary condition. And I always admired how people in communities such as this embrace their identity and their difference and do not want to renounce their origin and try to make a way in the world with that mancha de plátano. That is, we are a diasporic nation. That's another thing. We have entered to a new phase in which there are that many more Puerto Ricans outside than in the island. So it is expected that our population will dip below 3 million by 2030. We are at 3.2 right now. But we have 5-6 million Boricuas outside. So we are going to be a diasporic nation for the rest of this century at least. And we're going to have to find ways to harness that energy because it's there and we need to work on it. No sé si te contesté la pregunta. Probando.
I just wanted to mention that even though people are not here discussing this important situation, but organizing a Fiestas Patronales in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and participating of a culture that is obviously strange to this American continent, is also doing political work. It is also political to go out in the streets and hear Spanish music playing live. So I think that if there is a will to go and to organize all those cultural activities, it's just one more step into participating and making sure that the political participation is actually going to vote and organizing locally and making sure that your neighbors go out and vote and that voting matters. But I feel there is a political action by organizing a fiesta patronal and making sure that there is cultural and artistic activity in Spanish and keeping that heritage alive.
Fuímonos. Thank you so much for being here. Buenas noches.